Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Tea for One. I'm your host, Rowan, and we will dive into all topics tea related: biology, history, culture, growing, producing tea, and so much more. Episode 3 will focus on tea production from leaf to cup, as well as some uncommon teas. What are all the steps and stages to tea production? What are some global tea companies' industrial standards? And what are some of those uncommon teas like rooibos, puree, and oolong? Hopefully we can answer all those questions by the end of this episode. So, before we begin, I highly recommend you get a nice cup of tea and find a peaceful spot to listen as we talk about Camellia sinensis. If you have tuned in for the first and second episodes of this podcast, then you are familiar with some of the steps and stages of tea production. Today, however, I really want us to dive into each step for a large company, so when you're drinking your Twinings, Tazo, Lipton, Bigelow, or whatever brand of tea, you have a physical product of this grand machination. As our example, let's talk about the Charleston Tea Plantation in South Carolina. There's almost 130 acres of Camellia sinensis, nurseries, and production factories. The plants were taken from China in the 17th century, and the plants today are the descendants and clones of the originals. This plantation has switched ownership many times since its beginning in 1799, but right now Bigelow is running the oldest American soil tea plantation. In the context of mass-producing tea by large companies, this is a tiny plantation, however. One of the largest commercial tea plantations is owned by Unilever, the owner of Lipton and many other tea brands, in Kenya, that stretches over 27,000 acres, employs 24,000 people, and has numerous factories on site. Anyways, let's look on a smaller scale of tea production at the Charleston plantation. For this example, we're going to follow some 5,000 pounds of freshly picked Camellia sinensis into black tea. As mentioned before in previous episodes, the first step to making any tea is called withering or drying. For black teas, they have to wither and oxidate longer than other teas to achieve its unique characteristics. So these leaves are placed on withering beds where they will stay for 18 hours. Most commercial withering beds are stainless steel and trough-like, and some have conveyor belt functions. Freshly plucked tea leaves are about 80% moisture, and that percentage has to go down to exactly 68% for Bigelow's tea standards. If the moisture were too low, then it would not make a fine quality tea because the enzymes have overbuilt inside the leaf. If they're not withered enough, then they haven't built up to the sufficient amount that would give you the full-bodied flavor when you drink a cup of hot or iced tea. Giant fans are a necessity for commercial tea production. They accelerate the drying process and make sure the leaves wither equally. The fans ultimately blow and suck air for hours at a time through the hundreds of holes in the withering beds. Without these fans, the leaves in the middle would turn red and spoil due to the lack of oxygen. Traditional tea manufacturing typically don't use massive fans because they produce much smaller quantities of the tea, and they can be placed to dry in a single layer, unlike commercial withering beds. After the withering process, the leaves at Charleston Plantation are conveyed to a shredding machine called a rotovane. Here the tea will be ripped into pieces small enough to fit in the tea bag, but it's not just size that's important. Shredding the leaves is a crucial step because it tears open the cell walls of the leaf, which allows the tea to oxidize. The physical and mechanical breaking of the cell wall encourages oxidation by interrupting the internal environment of the leaf, one that normally limits the amount of oxygen in the cells. This oxidation of tea leaves is the same thing that happens to when an apple or an avocado has been cut and left out to dry. There are many ways to break open the cell walls besides mechanical shredding, including a number of traditional rolling methods we've mentioned in previous episodes. The rotovane and other mechanical devices are widely used when working with large-scale amount of leaves, like the 5,000 pounds at Charleston. Inside the rotovane are stationary groove-like fingers called vanes, and the rotors that spin at high speeds. The rotovane will press the tea leaves against the vanes and rupture the cell wall and expose the tea juices and enzymes. Breaking the cell walls is necessary for high levels of oxidation, and the rotovanes does a great job in mashing the leaves into a vibrant green paste-like product. At this point, the shredded leaves come out of the rotovane and onto the oxidation bay. As mentioned before, oxidation is the defining phase in the process of making black or oolong tea. On the oxidation bay, the shredded green tea leaves will turn into a more coppery orange color. This stage in the process of making black tea is where the majority of the flavor is built. The oxidation gives the tea quality and also gives it the standard bold black tea taste. If the tea was given half that time to oxidate, it would make oolong tea, and if those leaves were prevented from oxidating, then green tea would be produced instead. In green tea, the leaves are heat neutralized and denatured to prevent oxidation right after they are plucked. Then those leaves will follow a similar process to black and oolong teas. However, we are looking at the Charleston plantation in South Carolina, and they are making black tea. After exactly 50 minutes on the oxidation bay, these leaves will produce the kind of light, bright tea that is favored in the US. The coppery-colored tea leaves will then go to a dryer where the moisture will drop from 68% to just 2%. Leaves are dried to exactly 2% moisture content because anything more would allow the tea to mold later on. The harvested leaves now have reduced to 20% of its original size and weight. That's how about 5 pounds of tea in the field goes to make a single pound of tea. That pound is now going to go through a series of shaker sieves to remove impurities like twigs and rocks. The final sieve will use static electricity to pull out tiny bits of fiber. In other tea facilities, these pieces are painstakingly plucked by hand. But here, plastic rollers are pressed against felt underneath that creates a static charge. As the black tea goes along the conveyor, all the stems and bits of fiber are sucked up on the roller and taken out of the black tea. Okay, now we have pure black tea ready to drink, right? Well, most Americans don't drink loose-leaf teas, and they need something pre-packaged with a set amount of tea that can be easily disposed of, like a tea bag. The tea bag didn't arrive until the 12th century, but it quickly established itself as one of the most iconic everyday objects of modern life, especially in the US. The Lipton Tea Company alone makes some 9 billion tea bags a year in the US. Their tea bagging facility holds long rows of frantic machines that punch out 1 million tea bags an hour, 24 million a day, 7 days a week. These machines make around 200 bags a minute, and using an astonishing 2,500 moving parts that whip together to make simple pouches. These Lipton tea bagging components, the paper, the labels, string, staples, fly through these machines with impressive speed and precision. The sides of the bags are not glued together but folded so neatly that they hold their shape when steeped in boiling water. The center fold must be tight to prevent any leaves from getting into the cup. Funnily enough, the tea bags were an accidental revolution. In 1908, an American tea seller sent out samples of tea in silk pouches. Instead of taking the tea out to brew it loose leaf style, the buyers just dropped the pouches in hot water, and the tea bag was born. Eventually, the silk became gauze, and gauze became paper. Then commercial tea production in the 1920s added the string and tag. A big breakthrough in the tea bagging technology came in the 1950s, if you can believe it. Lipton introduced new tea bagging machines that are still used today, and these machines were designed to create the Lipton signature double-sided or flow-through bag. The idea was to increase the surface area and diffusion from 2 sides by exposing the water to 4 sides, which would act as though you were using 2 tea bags instead of 1. And Lipton converted their entire operation to manufacturing that bag, and it vaulted Lipton to the #1 position in the marketplace. Others try and innovate the tea bag technology while still competing with the traditional tea bag, like having pyramid-shaped tea bags that can hold larger leaf pieces. Okay, now we have the tea in a tea bag and it's ready to be shipped, right? Nope. Majority of global tea companies like Lipton and Bigelow have tea standards they must uphold. All these teas at these companies are actually made from blends of dozens of individual teas, so making sure the blends have consistent flavor, color, and mouthfeel requires constant changes to the formula and constant tasting. The reason they have to keep tasting to maintain that iconic taste is that every tea garden makes a different type of tea every week. The quality of their teas can change according to weather, or how well it was plucked, or how well it was rolled. So, it's like a juggling act for these tea makers. Lipton has devised a numerical code from 1 to 7 on each element of the tea, like taste, color, viscosity, etc. So, for each blend it has their own score to uphold. Like their standard black tea has a 4.4 for taste, a 6.8 for color, and a 4.8 for thickness. Professional tea tasting is a skill that requires 4 to 5 years of intense training. During their training, they can taste as many as 1,200 teas in one day. One of the tea tasters at Lipton says, "It's a bit like learning how to play a musical instrument. The more you practice, the better you'll get at it. And the more you practice, the more you're better to pick out the different types of tastes. And in the end, you're able to pick out the best teas that will fit the Lipton blends." Lipton's ever-changing blend sheets are programmed at company headquarters in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, then downloaded into a computerized blend system across their factories. Vast quantities of tea are moved around the world and processed every day, being vigorously shifted to remove impurities, then funneled into the massive silos. A silo will hold about 10,000 pounds, which is typically used in one 24-hour period. The silos themselves initiate Lipton's blending process by swirling the teas together as they fall through a conical end. The conveyor belts then carry the tea from the silos to this blending machine, which gently tumbles the day's recipe. The blends then are conveyed to a 2,000-pound super sack that feeds the tea bag machines. Once they are bagged, they are sent off to stores where they'll be purchased and finally made into tea. That was a long journey for commercial tea production, and the sheer quantity of the tea leaves and herbs going into those factories every day is mind-boggling. So let's switch tracks for a bit. At the beginning I mentioned some oddball teas, let's get into that. First, let's discuss oolongs. Oolong is a Chinese tea, also called dark dragon tea, and what makes it unique is that it's semi-oxidized. The amount of oxidation allowed can range greatly, making the variety of different flavors an oolong can possess. Let's look at this like a spectrum, with green tea being at one end with no oxidation and black tea being on the other end fully oxidized. Oolong would fall in the middle, meaning depending on how long it's been oxidized, it can have qualities more similar to a green tea and others can have ones that are closer to a black tea. Since oolong has a massive spectrum, its flavors can be sweet and fruity with honey aromas, or woodsy and thick with roasted aromas, or even green and fresh with complex aromas, all depending on the horticulture and style of production. Since it's the bridge between green and black teas, it only makes sense that the steeping time and the water temperature would be in the middle of the two. Oolong tea should be steeped anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes, so make sure you look at the recommendations on that specific oolong. And the water temperature should be from 80 to 95 degrees Celsius, or 180 or 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And continuing a trend of being in the middle, oolong's caffeine levels are between that of green and black teas. Next, let's discuss a controversial tea, white tea. White tea doesn't have a universally accepted definition of what it is. Some say it is made from the tea leaf buds and immature leaves and then it is sun-withered. Others claim that it is very young leaves that need to be heated before drying. Most definitions agree, however, that white tea is not rolled or oxidized, resulting in the flavor characterized as lighter than most green or traditional black teas. In spite of its name, the sweet brewed white tea is a pale yellow color. Its name actually derives from the fine silvery white hairs on the unopened buds of the tea plant, which gives the plant a whitish appearance. These unopened buds are used for some types of white tea. Because white tea is made from either buds or immature leaves, less can be harvested from each plant, and in turn raising the price compared to other teas. Also, because the leaves have yet to fully develop, you have to use at least 2 tablespoons per 8 ounces of water, and they have to steep around 5 minutes. And since the leaves are delicate too, they must be brewed at lower than boiling temperatures, like green tea. When you have crafted a cup of white tea, it should have a mellow and delicate taste, which is often described as floral, fresh, fruity, with a hint of cucumber or melon. Puree is a special Chinese fermented black tea. However, the process of making this tea is the most distinctive of any we've talked about so far. First, all puree is made from a mostly unoxidized green tea base called miaocha, or rough tea. This can then be processed through a traditional sheng, or raw style, or it can be processed through a modern shao, or ripe style. The raw style of production takes years to ferment, similar to wine, while the ripe style is sped up version, easier for mass production. After the teas have fermented and dried, they are pressed. Traditionally, a heavy stone was used to press the puree into dense bricks. However, at factories, hydraulic press are used. There are several different shapes these teas can take, like discs, bowls, bricks, mushrooms, balls, or melons. And like some wine, these compressed teas go through a solid state fermentation, which is much slower and a lot less volatile than previous fermentation processes. So, a puree that is made at the same time with the same exact leaves, but have a 15-year difference in fermentation will taste vastly different. These teas should be brewed from between 85 to 99 degrees Celsius or 185 to 210 Fahrenheit. Since puree comes in compressed forms, the leaves are given rinses, then brewed for only 12 to 30 seconds, and after each infusion increasing the time by 5-ish seconds. Like other teas, if it is left to steep too long, then it can produce a dark, bitter, and unpleasant brews. A good cup of puree should be delightfully nutty and earthy, with some notes of sweet floral honey and a cooling clamber finish. Some people also describe puree as slightly mushroomy in flavor, likely due to the fermentation process. Okay, so these two next teas we will talk about aren't even really tea. Well, they are tea-like, but the key difference is they aren't made from Camellia sinensis. Rooibos is a popular herbal tea from southern Africa. Rooibos, or also called Asplanthe linearis, is often called a tea bush or red tea. Traditionally, rooibos is oxidized, giving it a distinctive reddish-brown color, and this process enhances the flavor. Unoxidized green rooibos is also produced, but the more demanding production process for the green rooibos, similar to the methods by which green tea is produced, makes it more expensive than a traditional rooibos. It carries a malty and slightly grassy flavor, somewhat different from its red counterpart. Since it's an entirely different plant than a camellia, rooibos don't actually have caffeine. Instead, they contain a high amount of ascorbic acid, or vitamin C. And again, since it's an herbal tea, they must be brewed at boiling for around 5 minutes. This cup of reddish-brown tea can have a multitude of flavors, like smoky, sweet, woodsy, grassy, vanilla, floral, honey, herbal, and caramel. The last tea-ish tea we will discuss is one that has skyrocketed in popularity, mate. Mate comes from a plant called yerba mate, which is a type of holly. The leaves are picked and dried, no oxidation necessary. Traditionally, the mate is served in a calabash gourd, also called mate. The leaves are placed in the cup and brewed to 70 to 85 degrees Celsius, or 158 to 185 degrees Fahrenheit, water. Then it is drank with bombilla, a metal straw with a round sieve at the end. This works to prevent any pieces of the mate from being sucked up into the straw. And despite technically being an herbal tea, mate has quite a big amount of caffeine and caffeine derivatives. It has more than a cup of black tea or matcha, but less than a cup of coffee. However, since the caffeine derivatives are different to that of coffee and tea, the drinker will likely feel a caffeine rush despite their normal caffeine consumption. A nice gourd of mate usually tastes vegetal, earthy, herbaceous, and bittersweet. That was a lot, but hopefully you learned something interesting about the mass production of tea and information about some uncommon teas. This is Tea for One, and until next time.